Excellent. So yeah, welcome everybody. I see again, like people are still coming in. So we're just gonna start very briefly by welcoming all of you to this session. I'm going to present Zara very briefly, and then I'm gonna pass you the word so you can present what you have here to share with us. So the name of this talk is Cannabis Regulation in Mexico, Social Justice or Extractive Industry. Zara Snapp has a master's in public policy from Harvard University and a political science degree from the University of Colorado. She is the co-founder of Instituto RIA, RIA, a Mexican organization which undertakes drug policy advocacy and research. Zara has actively participated in the legislative process of regulating cannabis in Mexico and is the international advisor for Acción Técnica Social in Colombia. From 2014 to 2017, she formed part of the Secretariat of the Global Commission on Drugs. Zara presents and writes extensively on innovations in drug policy, particularly on the legal regulation of all psychoactive substances with a social justice framework and from a producing country perspective. Zara is the author of the Diccionario de Drogas, published in 2015. So yeah, welcome everybody. Zara, thank you for joining us, and the stage is all yours.
Gracias, Adam. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos. It's nice to be here with you all. I've been watching the sessions that have been going on all day, and it's been very interesting. I always feel like a fish out of water at the Sacred Plants conferences, but I'm also feel very lucky because I've participated in all of them since they were being done in Mexico, and BIA was when BIA was based in Mexico, and we were working on these issues here. But just to Adam gave a bit of my professional background, and I want to talk today about what's going on in Mexico, and hopefully if people have questions, they can ask questions and we can make it a little bit more dynamic, also because I probably won't be able to use the presentation I prepared. But just to give you an idea of, so I come to these issues and this area of work from if I always feel bad because it's like I don't come from it from like that this is my medicine. My background is more of using plants and psychoactive substances the way that many of you would probably term it, as partying or as recreational, and as with not using it in ceremonial settings, but rather really using it as a way to express myself freely and finding ways to connect with different people, having a lot of the realizations that I hear during these sessions, and I learn a lot in these sessions because of that, because this isn't necessarily my world of going and doing ceremonies with different communities or seeking it out in that way, but rather that my experiences with plants and psychoactive substances is much more related to something that brings people together, and oftentimes there is an intention behind it, but sometimes that intention is pleasure, and that's something that I think we lose sight of sometimes when we're having these conversations, and more also when I was hearing a lot of the talks about how do you overcome trauma and how do you work through different the structural and the situational inequalities that we live as individuals, and within the privilege that some of us carry, and then the oppression that can create for others. And so I would say that when I hear people talking about their experiences with plant medicines, and sacred plants, I've felt that power, and I've felt that healing, and I've felt that, Karen, I think if you give me, maybe it'd be great. And thank you. You're a wonderful person to help me. So I felt that there's great use and great value in the plants and psychoactive substances that I've used, but it's not that I'm doing research around how can these be used to heal others. My background is a political scientist. I come from a social justice background. As a means to right inequities that I have been feeling since I was, a young person. And I came to work in these issues first with sexual and reproductive health, and how do we defend the rights of people to make choices about their sexuality and about their sexual lives. And there we work a lot with decision making, which is also then becomes related to how are we making decision making around using, whether it's in a ceremonial setting or not, how do we make decisions around using plants and psychoactive substances or sacred plants or medicinal plants. But I think that, before we get to that point, oftentimes we need to have those conversations of breaching those, you have to, and in the panel before this, they were talking a lot, because it was Dayara and Miguel, and capitalism, and how capitalism is spurring extractive practices. And so I think that these are all connected. We're obviously living at an intersection. And I come at this from a social justice and a policy space, but also as a person who uses plants and psychoactive substances in a great variety of ways, both therapeutic, both, for adult use, and because it brings pleasure and intention, and I can bring purpose to decision making sometimes through the use of different plants and psychoactive substances. But so today I'm going to talk about the process that we're going through in Mexico on regulating cannabis. This is something that has been a long process, a long legislative process, and that has changed in the discourse and the empathy and how we think about this issue greatly, because of bringing greater attention to the communities that participate in this process. So I think when we see regulatory processes around the United States or in Canada, or even in the Colombian medical cannabis market, it's very
commercial. It's a commercialized model that does not necessarily have social justice at its center or repairing the harms of prohibition, even when we know that millions of people have been harmed by policies that are still taking place. And that oftentimes within these regulatory models, increased sanctions occur for people who are operating outside the market, and that then can exacerbate already issues that are already occurring. And when we began this process several years ago, and I've been working on this for about 10 years, but we had big conversations about, is it possible to dismantle the capitalist model as we create a legal regulation model for cannabis in Mexico? And we looked at all of the free trade agreements that Mexico has signed and the laws that, that Mexico has to uphold, and the geopolitical place, that situation that Mexico finds itself in. And it was a pragmatic decision of, no, you can't. You have to find a way to fit in with the globalized model that already exists. And that was I think probably for many of us who are optimists, one wants to be able to think that with policy change, and that is accompanied by cultural and, mindset change, which is something they were talking about in the previous panel, which was important, that all these people who, has the widespread use of psychedelics or the widespread use of ayahuasca changed, social and racial inequities. And no, I mean, racism and classism still exists greatly. But maybe on an individual level, people have been changed. Or maybe they were already, didn't consider themselves racist. But so we had to figure out, how do we fit into a model that already exists, a globalized model, an economy already exists. And then how do we start chipping away at that as a means to create a better distribution of wealth in the production chain, and a better means of helping or accompanying, we tend to use accompanying communities from an illegal market to a legal market. And what does that mean? And how do you create incentives and benefits for people to want to do that? Recognizing that some people, and in Mexico, we have conversations about, what would peyote regulation look like, or psilocybin regulation look like? Or is decriminalization maybe enough for some of these plant medicines, because you don't want to create rules and criteria around these plants? You want to build in access and take away criminalization, but you don't want to implant a commercial model that could be detrimental to communities that are already living under circumstances where mining and where violence and displacement is undergoing all the time. So that's where you start to think about, who are we creating public policies for? And over the last few years, myself and my colleagues at a coalition that we created called Regulación por la Paz, or Regulation for Peace, one of the things we tried to do before we had to stop traveling as much was to understand the currently illegal market and what it has. What makes up the currently illegal market? Because also, and this is maybe the folks who are watching us here, this is not one of the pieces, but one of the main questions I'm asked is, how will the narcos respond to cannabis regulation? The narcos. And I, in my presentation, and I'll get to it in a second, I want to deconstruct a little bit about the kind of discourse that we're pushing when we ask those types of questions, understanding that, yes, there are people who are functioning in illegal markets, and there are people who are also committing horrendous crimes that we read about in the news, and horrendous crimes that we have normalized in our own, at least in Mexico, because you can't feel everything that happens. Otherwise, the trauma that you carry becomes unbearable. And that's where also then one does think about, how do we incorporate some of these plant medicines and some of this research and some of these this ceremony that folks have been talking about throughout these last 2 days, as a means of repairing the harm and the trauma that people in Mexico are experiencing because of great loss, of life, of culture, of their community, if they've been displaced, having family members who've been disappeared. There's all these I think that the plants that exist in Mexico, psilocybin, peyote, sapo, and animals, and cannabis, are going to play a great role in our need to overcome trauma and move towards reconciliation as a country in Mexico. And we've seen this with sometimes just, of how do you let go? How do you allow yourself to relax? How do you feel? How do you, I think the anger is there, but then how do we overcome anger? Recognizing that in reality, and a lot of the harms that have been perpetuated in Mexico and in other places, there will never be a reparation. A reparation is not possible because the harm is too great, because the pain will be too great. But then how do you ease some of that pain for people to move forward in their lives, especially when they have such a strong and important role to play in telling their story? And that's what we see with people who have family members who've been disappeared. The importance of sharing their stories, because it helps to build an empathy and understanding, and also an urgency to make change. And that's what, I hope that, and I'll talk a bit about what's going on in Mexico, but I think at the end of the day, this is like, how do all of us engage and work so that change can happen? Because we are not going to dismantle the systems that have already implanted capitalism, neoliberal, extractive policies into our countries. But we're trying to shift them, and with people, I do think that if people have greater consciousness, we can begin to shift towards something where you do less harm as a person. Because, and we talk about harm reduction obviously a lot, and managing pleasure. So how do you reduce harm and manage pleasure? And how do you reduce harm in the policies that we're implementing? How do governments reduce harm? And that's, I think, the philosophy we've had to take in policy making processes, because it's not easy. It's actually quite hard to fit yourself into, when you have a social justice focus, to fit yourself into a model that is already quite ingrained and quite it's very hard to dismantle it. And prohibition is that. It's also about how are we dismantling prohibition, and we'll see what that looks like over the next 20 years. I'm wondering if Karen, if you're still there, we can open up the slides. And so really thank you for helping me too. This is really about balance. How do we balance justice with reality, with pragmatism? So if you want to go to the first, there we go. So, so I just want the current reality, I think, in many countries, and this is throughout Latin America, and, the majority of, I live in Mexico. My parents are from the United States. They moved here in the 70s, and I grew up here and also in the States, but I have lived here my adult life. And so this is the experience that I have seen in my work, and then also, working a lot in Colombia. And that's really that we've created circumstances under which war, conflict, violence, and criminalization are completely acceptable. And this because it's needed, because there's bad people, because there's people who are doing bad things, and so we need to be criminalizing. And the way to do that is to fight violence with violence, and so we militarize. And so countries receive international aid to fight drug trafficking, which is then used to buy arms, equipment, and technical capacity, usually from the country that's giving that aid. So in the case of Plan Colombia, in the case of the Mérida Initiative in Mexico, like all of the funds that Mexico gets, we use to buy arms and equipment from the United States. It's literally a circular business that the United States is just making money off of. And Plan Colombia was the same. And it's a way also for countries like the United States to justify having foreign military bases in other countries. And this is something we've seen all throughout Central America and in Latin America. And then the kingpin strategy, which has been the strategy that has been pushed in Latin America, you know, taking out the top, really the only thing it's done is has resulted in fractured organized criminal groups that then have to have greater structure of violence. They use greater violence to maintain their structure. So there's certain groups, for example, that function more as like a family business, and so there's loyalty that keeps them together. But as you take out the kingpins, then internal fighting happens and you see fracturing. And so in Mexico, for example, 14 years ago, we had maybe 8 or 9 organized criminal groups operating in the country. Now we have 80 or 90. And then just the structural condition of poverty, because we pay, you know, wages that are paid are extremely low. The free trade agreements with the United States caused a huge number of maquilas to be built, where then people migrated to cities where they didn't have social networks or social support, which then caused, you know, have the social fabric that they might have had in their communities of origin. And this poverty facilitates the capacity to recruit for both organized criminal groups, but then also for the military, because the military needs people to be constantly working. And then the official narrative of creating the public enemy, the other, which can range from people who use drugs. So the government oftentimes justifies that people who have been disappeared or people who've been murdered, but they were using drugs. We knew that they used cannabis. We knew that they were a sex worker. We knew that, you know, you can use anything, any label, to undervalue them as a person. And so then even in Mexico, you know, the legal sanction for carrying any amount of drug that's above a certain limit is called narcomenudeo, and in English it's like small scale trafficking. But really, they gave it that term, narcomenudeo, because then it's all related to this term, narco, which has a stigma to it. And so it's worked very well for the government to be able to justify actions, and not just this government, but all of the previous governments too, to justify actions against communities and against people. So private corporations fund paramilitary groups, and we know that this happens, for example, in the state of Guerrero, in order to deteriorate the rule of law. And by funding them, you ingrain violence, you know, have them do a shootout that lasts 6 hours, and the community will be displaced. So the community leaves, and then that private corporation has free reign to explore, possibly because they have other interests such as mining. And so there is this, because of the lack of rule of law generally, and then private corporations oftentimes can deteriorate and degenerate that in order to further their economic interests. And this is something that is happening. I'm not in a conspiracy frame of mind. This is happening, and this happens in Colombia and in Central America for years. Chiquita Banana was behind paramilitary groups in Colombia and was sanctioned for it. So this is something that's happening, and that very little is being done about it. Next slide, please. Karen. I don't think I can. Okay, so then cultivating communities, which is one of the groups that we work closely with, and that we are, also I can't generalize on cultivating communities in Mexico, because Mexico is a country of 130 million people with huge geography. But cultivating communities are really stuck, because most of the time they have to take out a loan to be able to get seeds, to be able to plant their crops. Then they get paid low prices from organized criminal groups, rather whoever the intermediary is puts the price. If they could choose to take a risk to find a better price, or they could have their crops eradicated by the government, in which case then they don't get any money, and then they have to pay back the loan they took out, and they get into a very stuck economic conditions. Less than 1% of the revenues of, in the case of cocaine, less than 1% of the revenues do not remain in the country of origin. So less than 1% of the revenues of the cocaine market stays in Colombia, whereas 65% remain with retailers in countries of consumption. And so this is when you look at how the revenues are spread across countries of origin, countries of consumption. It's not fair. Like, especially when you think the majority of the people, and I, heard some comments about cocaine, and I've worked a lot on cocaine regulation in Colombia. Like, most people who are using cocaine are using it in an adult use personal setting less than 10 times a year. And it's because they have it and they want it. They would, and the majority of those people, when we've done surveys with them, have said that they would be willing to pay more for cocaine that is considered fair trade, or cocaine that's considered that's not grown under violent circumstances. And so people, like, we could be paying fair prices, but prohibition doesn't allow you to do that because there's all these hidden costs and hidden interests along the way. We also never hear anything about banks that are laundering all of this money. And so really, when you think about this, then a neoliberal capitalist model is favored by prohibition because it limits access to substances that alter the perception about the role of humans on the planet, but also because it has been a very good business for them, because we can buy arms, and because being in a state of war creates builds in oppression, and it builds in justification for human rights violation and dictatorships and authoritarian governments. And so all of this, and foreign intervention and investment into the insecurity of countries. And so all of this creates a machinery that then it's very hard to try and dismantle. So can we do anything? I try to be an optimist and always think that we can. And so in Mexico, we've been going down this very long road. And if you want to go to the next one, Karen, in order to see how can cannabis regulation in Mexico be tied to human rights of people who use, in this case, cannabis, although, as you'll see, we could extend it to any other plant or substance, and also communities that cultivate. And we got to this point in Mexico thanks to jurisprudence. It is not because we have a Pepe Mujica who is pushing this. It's not because there's, great acceptance in public opinion. It's really because activists accompanied by lawyers moved this forward by getting jurisprudence. But in Mexico, you don't get jurisprudence with winning one case at the Supreme Court. You have to win 5 consecutive cases with the same criteria and using the same number of votes. And so this whole process began in 2012 when a lawyer, Andres Aguinaco, started thinking about this and brought forward the first case, which was resolved 3 years later in 2015. And this case is known as SMART. And what SMART alleged, and the Supreme Court said, yes, this is correct, is that the absolute prohibition of cannabis is unconstitutional because it violates our constitutional right to the free development of personality. And that when you look at, when you weigh the harms of using cannabis versus its possibility of having a positive impact on your free development of personality, that by prohibiting it from someone, you are violating that right because it does not cause great harm to your health. And that, they did some stuff around prohibition as well. But so it authorized the cultivation and all related activities, including, harvesting and consuming and transporting, etc., for personal use without harming any other third parties. And so that was the first case. It identified 5 articles of the general health law that then that were considered those that prohibit cultivating cannabis for personal use that are unconstitutional. When Andres won that first case, and the people they used for that first case were business people. They were people who upstanding citizens, who said, no, I don't use cannabis. I'm just doing this because it's the right thing to do. Which I understand why you have to do that, because you have to be able to present it in the public sphere. And we did that also with cases on medical cannabis. You choose the cases that you're going to present to the public to build in empathy, which is just something that has to be done. And it works, right? In 2018, the next cases came up. So it took 3 years from winning the first case, and then the next cases came in. And essentially what would happen is that you apply to the government for permission to cultivate cannabis for personal use. They say no, and then you file a lawsuit against the government saying you are violating my right to the free development of personality, and then you go through the whole legal process. So in 2018, a lawyer named Ulrich Richter won the second case. It was exactly the same. Then Armando Rios Peter, who was an presidential candidate, a very upstanding citizen as well, he won the third case. I won a case in the Supreme Court in 2018 as well with Arambarra, and my case had to do with how do you access the seeds. So when you are given this right to cultivate cannabis for personal use, it's great, but then how do you ensure that you will be able to exercise that right through accessing the seed and then planting? And on October 31st, 2018, we won 2 consecutive cases, and that was where then jurisprudence was declared. And it was published in February of the next year. And what this did then was obligate judges to rule the same way as the Supreme Court had ruled. That on one hand. And on the second one was to sends a mandate to Congress and the Senate to legislate on the issue within 90 days. The next one, please, Karen. But so it made it easier for folks to be able to go through the whole process again, no? And so now we probably have thousands of people who have amparos and who could cultivate their plants and there isn't a limit on the plants. It's the plants that you need for your 100 plants outside. I think I have like 15, but it's up to each person what they think they need. And so we went through a very extensive legislative process from October 31st to November 19th, when the first bill was passed in the Senate. So that's 2 years. And in those 2 years, they were obviously supposed to approve the bill before then, but they asked for extensions from the Supreme Court because the topic was so complicated, and then because the pandemic hit and they asked for more time. But they worked on a project. It got passed in committee, 3 of the committees, and then it goes to the Senate. And on November 19th, they approve it. 82 votes in favor, 18 against, and 7 abstentions. And this, we saw a huge discourse and change in how people were talking about this. It was no longer, it's overwhelming approval. No, 82 in favor. Talking about rights, talking about liberties, talking about the economic benefits that could come to the country, talking about social justice. And this bill had some very important pieces that was passed, which one was that 40% of the licenses that were for cultivation were exclusively for communities that either currently cultivate illegally or that form part of the social sector, that have that are in Mexican law ejidos, communal properties, or indigenous lands. And so 40% of those licenses was just for those communities. And then in addition, the day before this vote happened, and then they took it out right at the last minute, vertical integration was limited to only those communities. Like, it was exclusively for those communities. Whereas previously, whereas then they voted a project and essentially it said, whatever you can have as many licenses as you want, all kinds of licenses, right? The next one, Karen, because I saw Adam, so I want to make sure because I have 2 minutes. I have 2 minutes?
I mean, you're already over time.
I'm over time?
Yes. But I mean, we have in in general 10 more minutes or so, but I do want to leave some time for people to ask questions.
So I'll just say, so this was approved in the plenary in March of this year of the Congress, but it was a whole different project. Something happened to my slide there. Apologies. It was a whole different project. If you want to go to the next one, and I'll go quickly so I can, in case there are. And so when we talk about this, you know, and this has been a theme throughout the whole conference, you know, what does even development mean? What does, they were having a very intense conversation on reciprocity. What does reciprocity mean? And for us, the way that we've been defining and working to integrate social justice through this whole process is that, one, it has to confront the dynamics of privilege and oppression. So I recognize that myself as a white woman in Mexico, because of where my parents came from, I'm able to talk about my use without it having negative impacts on my personal or professional life. Most people don't have that privilege. Two, that we need to recognize the existence of groups that have been historically and are currently marginalized, which we identified as people who cultivate and people who use cannabis. Generate affirmative actions to balance the level of justice and power. So it's not about creating a market that is for everyone, but rather how do you build in benefits for specific communities? And then finally, how do you designate resources towards reparations? So how do we ensure that reparations happen, but on a continual basis throughout implementation, and that there is continuous dialogue that happens. The next one, please. And see if I don't have any questions, then I can just finish my presentation. It won't be that bad. And so the Ley Federal de Regulación de Cannabis, which is now stuck in the Senate, and they might ask for another extension because elections are in a month and they are not sure if, well, they don't want to pass the bill that could negatively impact them in the elections, is that it allows cultivation for personal use, 6 plants, or 8 if there are 2 adults living in the house, but you have to get a permit from the National Commission on Drug Addiction. Cannabis associations that can have between 2 and 20 members, with a limit of 50 plants per association. And then a regulated commercial market, which is overseen. It was going to be overseen by a new institute that would be created. Now it's going to be overseen by the National Commission on Drug Addiction, which is problematic for us because it's a law on regulating adult use and not necessarily people who have some sort of dependency problem. And then they took away the 40% of licenses that went to communities, and they changed it to that preference and priority will be given to communities. And so then for us, what it means is, like, what does preference or priority even mean? How do we define preference or priority? How do we measure it in the long term? And if you want to go to the next one, and then I can close. And so what we continue to work on, and this is knowing the context of Mexico, is that there are already fines for activities for being outside of the legal market, or possessing above 28 grams. You know, when you possess above 28 grams, they can fine you between $250 and $500 US. That's completely out of reach for most people in Mexico. Simple possession continues, so it continues to be a crime, and the most likely scenario, if somebody gets caught carrying any amount of cannabis or any other substance, is that 1, the police will extort you, or 2, you will you'll have, you'll be detained for up to 48 hours, where horrible things can happen to you. And that's just a reality, and the reports that come out and the testimonies that we hear continue to show that. There is now this permit for cultivation for personal use that we believe should be taken out because it violates your right to privacy, and also, why do they need a list of people who are cultivating for personal use? We would provide 100% of the licenses that allow for vertical integration to communities for the first 3 years, because it's very important to have a restricted model that will allow for this horizontal market to exist before you open it up to large interests. And these are the lessons that we're learning from other places like Colombia, where it is external forces that come in and take over the market. And then finally, there's there's a supposed it's a transitory article which would allow for the release of people incarcerated for cannabis offenses, but it's not automatic. It's something that folks would have to apply for. And so one of the things that we think is important is that it would be automatic, as it has been in some of the states in the United States where they've implemented similar regulations. And so right now, politically, it's just stuck in the Senate. They have an April 30th deadline, but today's April 25th. They have not passed it yet. And they are threatening to ask for more time, to ask for another extension, because of elections primarily, and because they don't like that the project changed so much between the two houses. Adam, sorry to go over. But I don't think I have any questions, so I think it's okay.
It's good. I think we don't have any questions in the chat. I don't know if somebody we have maybe 5 minutes if somebody feels inspired to ask something, and if not, maybe Zara, you can just give us a.
Adam, where are you from?
Chilango.
It is Chilango? Okay, Mexico City.
Was born in Mexico City, but yeah, I mean, I left when I was younger, and I'm living in Puerto Vallarta, and in the Nayarit Riviera. The last 4.5 years I spent in the Amazon rainforest, been working in the Peruvian jungle.
With ayahuasca.
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing field work for my doctoral dissertation and facilitating workshops in the place where I'm doing my field work. So doing kind of like research and practical work. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in Veracruz.
Veracruz, nice.
Yeah.
Where in Veracruz?
Coatepec. So it's like coffee. So when we think about the market that we would want for cannabis, and you being a Mexican, you can comment on it. When you think about that, it's like I envision it more as a market like mezcal and not like tequila. Because with mezcal, you can, go and visit a palenque, and you just kind of, it's much more artisanal and not a huge commercial model.
Yeah.
And then we have these examples of like coffee in Mexico, which is completely extractive in the sense that those who cultivate the beans often sell them still in the fruit. And you sell it for 3 pesos the kilo for the fruit. And then whoever processes that is selling it for 250 pesos for half a kilo. And so it's like how the gains on the market are built in are not, it's not fair. It's not equal for the work that's gone into all of it. And that's one of the things that with cannabis, and I mean, I've been doing a lot of work on poppy cultivation too, here in Mexico. But it's like, how do you build in incentives for people to be in the legal businesses? And it's very hard because raw materials are just not well compensated, and that's a problem. And so how do we get like greater connection? So we give a course in RIA on cannabis with a social justice focus, but like for people who want to be entrepreneurs. And like there's a cannabis association in the south of Mexico that has more than 1,000 members, and they, for example, found a community in Jalisco that cultivates cannabis, and so they buy from that community and they take it to their southern state and distribute it among their members. But it's just like a self-regulated market stream, paying a fair wage, but getting a good product, supporting each other, and it's like, because as if the government doesn't put these things into place, then the people just do. We just do it. But I think we have to work on how do we build in mechanisms that push forward on more equitable distribution the resources in these markets, and especially markets that are transitioning from an illegal space to a legal space.
Yeah,
but
absolutely
not easy.
No, yeah, this is a massive undertaking, but a very, very welcome one. Muy bien. Bueno, Sara,
Where do you buy weed in Nayarit? In Puerto Vallarta? Do you smoke? Do you use cannabis?
I used to a lot. I haven't in the last few years. I do CBD. I do take CBD a lot.
Okay, but so this is my problem with, I mean, people in Mexico all the time are like, so who here uses it? It's like, that's like being like, well, yeah. It's like, I said, do you use sapo? And they're like, no, I just take DMT. I don't use the other alkaloids. And you're like, you're using what? Somebody's putting themselves on the line for it.
Totally. You know? Well, I mean, CBD is different because the cultivation of it is also different. I mean, I don't know if in Mexico that's the case too. I know that there's different permits for hemp than permits for cannabis in that sense of what you're.
Well, right now CBD is not legal. I mean, there's very few companies that can actually be legally dealing with CBD in Mexico. And I mean, if you're getting a full spectrum, they're growing cannabis the way they're growing any other kind of cannabis. They're just extracting. It's just higher. They're extracting and growing crops that are higher in CBD. You are a cannabis user, Adam.
Yes. Thank you for that. I forget about it sometimes. Yeah, good. So there's
Paola, thank you.
There's another room. If you guys want to continue the conversation, you can. Whoever wants to join, there's a meetup room when you go to the conference sessions. You can find it there. Thank you, Sara, and thank you everybody for joining.
Adam, un abrazo. Gracias a todos. Nos vemos.
Igualmente.